German rearmament is an accomplished fact, to be accepted. It is in our own interest to have a free, equal, and strong Germany, instead of the prostrate nation upon whom an unfair peace treaty was imposed 16 years ago.
There's always this nagging question, you know, what would we do if we were actually caught up in those times into what's called the appeasement era, once Hitler has come to power in Germany in the 30s.
I had a German friend, Karl-Heinz Bremen. We fought on opposite sides in the war. We always said, when this wretched business is over, we'll sit down and have a drink together, like gentlemen. The Versailles Treaty made a liar of me. Yes, a liar, Stevens. Because the terms that we, the victor, imposed were so harsh that Germany was simply finished. Well, one doesn't do that to a defeated foe. No, once you've got your man on the canvas, that ought to be the end of it.
What they did to Germany after the 1914-18 war, the Versailles Treaty, was an iniquitous treaty to lay on a defeated nation. It was unfair, it was brutal. It brought Germany to its knees, financially, economically. And of course, out of the rubble and out of the ashes rises this phoenix, a man with a strong, powerful voice, a demagogue, a fanatic.
Before Hitler came into power, the German army by treaty was limited to 100,000 men. But Hitler didn't merely ignore the treaty, he tore it up. And in 1935 ordered national conscription.
Looking back, it's always easy to see in hindsight, but when you're in the middle of a catastrophe or an impending catastrophe, you can't tell. Who can tell? Who knows?
Good morning,
Darlington stands for ideals that Stevens really loves. He loves the notions of honour and dignity and courtesy and, you know, strength in honour. Ideals that actually carried us into a terrible war.
This English lord was one of those Nazi sympathizers from the 30s, of which there were a number here, who were quite famous, some of them, and who did truly believe, most of them, and not through cynicism or anything else, but a kind of misplaced idealism or whatever, they really did believe that they could find an accommodation with Hitler and with Germany, and that World War II could be averted.
With tears in my eyes, I see that everyone here has recognized our right to be once again a strong nation. Germany needs peace and desires only peace.
I was very interested in the process by which a kind of an old English gentlemanly, fair play ethic was actually manipulated very much by the Nazis when they came to power. Hitler saw the opportunity to exploit what was essentially this naive but well-meaning, decent, outdated instinct on the part of the English aristocracy, and used many of these old English gents as pawns and manipulated them very skillfully.
Lord Darlington is a classic English gentleman of the old school. Decent and honorable and well-meaning. So are all of you here, all decent and honorable and well-meaning gentlemen. But, now excuse me, I have to say this. You are, all of you, amateurs. And international affairs should never be run by gentlemen amateurs.
The English, have a gentleman's approach. And when an agreement has been made, it should be honored. And of course, I think it took many of them really by surprise that the Germans had a completely different agenda.
So sorry to interrupt, but I just don't see how we can associate ourselves now with the Germans, with the Nazi Party. They have actually torn up and trampled on every single treaty and seem to be a worse threat than ever to the whole of Europe.
And Hitler mocked as he called the roll of his future victims.
Litauen, Estland, Norwegen, Schweden, Dänemark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Ungarn, Rumänien, Jugoslawien.
The Reichstag roared.
No one really knew what was happening at that time. There were people like Mussolini and Adolf Hitler who were bringing their nations to stand up with pride. And there were idealists who were from the right wing and from the left wing who had ideas about a new utopia. Hitler was showing them they believed a utopia. Stalin, on the other hand, was showing the left a utopia. They were idealists, they were fanatics, they wanted a new world order. We've seen the results, which we're still suffering from to this very day.
Hitler called upon Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudetenland, that part of Czechoslovakia heavily populated by Germans.
To my mind, the whole of Czechoslovakia is hardly worth the bones of a single one of our own young men.
Unfortunately, we have a small, noisy and corrupt war group here who don't realize that you Germans are, after all, only marching into your own back garden.
The Führer is a man of peace, to the depth of his soul. But he will not allow a small, second-rate country to thumb its nose at the 1,000-year German Reich.
Stalin must have read Mein Kampf. Roosevelt, I'm sure, must have read Mein Kampf. Didn't they see what was coming? No, we close our eyes to it, and maybe they didn't read, maybe they didn't understand what was coming.
And because the democracies of Europe were hungry for peace, Hitler, Prime Minister Chamberlain of Great Britain, Mussolini, Premier Daladier of France, met in Munich, removed a thorn from Hitler's side.
On September 29th, in return for Hitler's guarantee of world peace, Chamberlain and Daladier prevailed upon Czechoslovakia to give up the Sudetenland without a fight. And in Britain, a happy Chamberlain came back declaring he had achieved peace. Peace in our time. One of the most tragic and ironic scenes in all history.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
I'm of a Japanese background. I only missed by one generation, if you like, a time of near-totalitarian control in Japan. And I think it's very natural for people of my generation, and also, I suppose, of Germans of my generation, to ask this question. If I was born just a few years earlier, if I was born just one generation earlier, what would I have done? Would I have had the perspective, the insight, and the courage, physical and moral courage, to stand outside of that fervor?
You do please realize that his lordship's been the most valuable pawn that the Nazis have in this country over the last few years, precisely because he is good and honorable. I wish I weren't so drunk. I could make you understand.
Sir, I do understand. His lordship is working to ensure peace in our time.
For a while, I had this idea that actually most of us were butlers, politically and morally, perhaps, too. We try to take a sense of dignity, some kind of pride and joy out of doing our little job well. And we often don't quite know how our little contribution is going to be used.
Stevens.
Yes, Lord.
We have some refugee girls on the staff at the moment, I believe.
We do, my lord. Two housemaids, Elsa and Irma.
You'll have to let them go, I'm afraid.
Let them go, my lord.
It's regrettable, Stevens, but we have no choice. You've got to see the whole thing in context. I have the well-being of my guests to consider.
I think it needs to be said, it has to be said again and again and again, that we must act in a moral way.
You're saying that Elsa and Irma are to be dismissed because they're Jewish?
His lordship has made his decision. There is nothing for you and I to discuss.
You realize that if those girls have no work, they could be sent back to Germany.
It is out of our hands.
I'm telling you, Mr. Stevens, if you dismiss my girls tomorrow, it will be wrong. A sin, as any sin ever was one.
Appeasement and racism and those things exist today in all countries and all societies, and that's what the film is very good at, just touching on.
Even today, if you look at the world today, we haven't learned from our past mistakes. We are committing the same mistakes over and over again. Whether it is Bosnia or whether it is, any other place that has created a disaster.
Yes, his lordship asked about the Jewish girls.
Elsa and Irma?
Yes, he wondered where they were. He said it was wrong to dismiss them. I thought you'd like to know because I remember you were as distressed as I was about it.
As you were? As I recall, you thought it was only right and proper that they should be sent packing.
Now, really, Miss Kenton, that is most unfair. Of course I was upset, very much so. I don't like to see that sort of thing happening in this house.
Well, I wish you'd told me so at the time. It would have helped me a great deal if I'd known you felt the same way as I did. Why? Why, Mr. Stevens? Why do you always have to hide what you feel?
And I wanted this concept of dignity, Stevens's concept, his definition of dignity, which was the English butler idea of dignity. Never show your emotions, to, if you like, crash into and be subverted by a completely different idea of dignity, which is that kind of the political idea of dignity, that there is some dignity that comes from being a participant in a democratic society.
There's Harry Smith now, sir, giving you an earful of his philosophy.
It's one of the advantages and privileges of being born English that you can express your opinion freely. And vote in your member of parliament or vote him out.
In the end, Stevens has to realize that he has given his whole life and all his life's energy to an imperfect master, and in this case, a really imperfect one because he was a traitor, or considered a traitor.
Yes, Lord Darlington was among those who tried to make a deal with Hitler. And then there was a case after the war where he sued a newspaper for libel. The Express, was it? News Chronicle?
I couldn't say so.
Anyway, he lost. He was lucky, really, not to have been tried for treason.
To find at the end of his life that those values he's held to so much and because of the person he served, have been just dragged through the mud, and perhaps didn't hold as much water as he thought in the first place anyway. That's a terrible thing to think, to face, to contemplate.
See, when his lordship went to court, he sincerely expected he would get justice. And instead, the newspaper increased in circulation, and his lordship's good name was destroyed forever.
What about his godson, young Mr. Cardinal?
Oh, Mr. Cardinal was killed in the war. Our waitress.
The great books, the great novels, the great stories, they tend to be about flawed characters or flawed men who have show tremendous potential in one way, but really in some other way are weak. That's the stuff of drama.
He doesn't feel it's his place to question how his contribution is being used. And because of this, at the end of his life, he sees that all his efforts have been somehow deeply compromised.
The tired old man of Munich now knew that there could be no peace in our time.
What a century that it was. The terrifying century, 20th century, but also a great century.